Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another episode of an Evolved Review. I'm your host, James Caleb Kitchens, and I am joined each and every week right here from the Stovall Wrestling Network. Caleb Stovall, how's it going, man?
Hey, what's going on, man? Just I recently came back from the beach and stuff like that. So
Yeah, lucky, dude. I mean, I hopefully got a beach trip planned later on this summer. I'm
yeah, if you can
also,
get
yeah, and I'm also hoping that one day my beard will look as good in real life as it does in our, logo there.
it's funny that you should mention that too, because the hat right there, I just always wear this AEW hat, and I never intended for that to happen. But since he drew it in the logo, I was just like, well, I feel as
It's
though it's my gimmick.
it, it's become a staple now. I'm always wearing wrestling T-shirts. This is the um, Lethal Enforcers Aladdin shirt. I met up with Anthony Henry and Amber Young over the weekend, and they gave me this, which was amazing. So
Oh, that's
uh,
awesome.
huge kudos to them for that. That being said, we have some interesting stuff going on in the world of professional wrestling right now, but we are still covering Dark Side of the Ring, and today we are going to talk about the famous slap heard around the world with Dr. D. David Schultz.
Yep.
So what's your like overall thoughts on this episode? You know what? Were you familiar with the incident before you watched this, or how did it really go for you?
Actually, no, not really. I was not familiar with this at all. I thought, when the business got exposed or whatnot, I thought it was on like an NBC type special that I remember seeing as a kid, around 99, maybe around 98, 99, I think. But I remember seeing that, but I never heard of this slap heard around the world of like a reporter. But I've heard of stories now where reporters or media of any kind outside of wrestling that ask a wrestler, is wrestling fake? And wrestlers would, slap them. I didn't really know that that's kind of where this really started.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of familiar with the special that John Stossel did, but I wasn't really familiar with David Schultz and how he kind of played into all of it. So it was pretty interesting to learn about him. As we kind of talked about off mic a little bit, a lot really went into Vince McMahon kind of burying the legacy of David Schultz. I mean, he's kind of been removed from just about everything. You never see him in any highlight videos. He definitely isn't showing up for random, hey, this guy used to work here appearances on Monday Night Raw or anything like that. He's kind of been Benoit in a way, even though he didn't really do anything, to deserve that level of erasure from the history of WWE, especially as talented as he was.
Yeah, I didn't even know that he worked for WWE. That's probably why I never really heard this slap heard around the world thing. Like I never seen him in any video archives on the WWE network. I don't even think you can search his name, to be quite honest. I haven't really even heard of him like spoke on podcasts of wrestling.
Right.
Like I never heard this, and something else I didn't know about. I didn't really know about the John Stossel report. I didn't know that that's when they really tried to expose the business, or did expose it, I guess, in ways. But it's like, yeah, I didn't know that any of this happened. And if I don't know something happened in wrestling, then you know that, like, oh shit, then they really buried him.
I mean, the funny thing is, a lot of people attribute like the loss of, you know, uh, people upholding kayfabe. A lot of people attribute like the decline in wrestling's popularity to that. But if you look at it, the highest point of wrestling's popularity wasn't in the 80s; it was in the late 90s, and even a little bit in the early 2000s. What we would call the Attitude Era. That's when,
Absolutely.
yeah, that's when The Rock, Stone Cold, Mankind, Undertaker, Goldberg. I mean, Hollywood Hogan, the NWO. You just go on and on. These were all household names. Everybody knew who that was. I can remember, kids now talk about being bullied for liking wrestling, whereas that happened a little bit to me in high school. But when I was in like middle school, man, everybody watched wrestling.
Yeah, they did because it was at an all-time high. The Monday Night Wars changed the face of wrestling forever. And it's a time that we will never see again by any means. But that was when wrestling was at its all-time high because you had just the two popular companies. And everyone pretty much knew by then that the business, was a work and everything like that. But it didn't matter. Everyone just loved the stories that were being told. They fell in love with the characters, especially Stone Cold Steve Austin, like you mentioned, The Rock, Triple H, the NWO. It's just when everything was just different about it, and nobody cared that it was staged. That was a moot point if you really think about it.
Right. You were there to be entertained and to see what
Exactly.
happened next in the storyline. I can remember I had a couple of friends, we talk about this all the time that we were both, WCW guys growing up, and I had a couple of friends that were WWF guys, and what we would do is on Tuesday we'd get to school and they would tell me everything that happened on WWF, and I would tell them everything that happened on WCW. And Raw always seemed like it was shittier than Nitro to me. Um, you know, they would be like, I'd be like, yeah, man, the NWO came out and like they jumped these guys and like DDP saved them, and then like Kurt Hennig attacked him, and then they'd be like, yeah, man, like Kane hit some dude with like a fireball or whatever. I'd be like, that, uh, I okay, you know,
I don't know, man. I might have to, because I went, I went back and I've watched, a lot of the '98 Raws, and I still haven't even finished them really all. But like, there's been some that I have seen that was some of the best stuff I've seen on a wrestling show. Vice versa with Nitro. Even in and everyone talks about '98 as kind of their down year, but if you look at it, '98 was when WCW was at its highest, and they still were producing great nitros, even though they were 3 hours long.
yeah. They were doing amazing stuff. I mean, up until '99 is when the decline really happened, and that's when so many people were jumping ship. And this has been talked, about to death. As far as like what ultimately caused the downfall of WCW, but a lot of people talk about like, okay, Goldberg's the only guy they ever made, quote unquote. DDP is an argument for a close second, right? But they didn't give him the strap until it was way too late. Um,
Right.
they didn't give, they didn't know how to handle the end of the streak. I mean, the whole idea of the streak ending is like whoever ended that, it was just like the Undertaker's your WrestleMania streak. It was like whoever ends this, they have to be the next thing. Like they have, the next big thing. They have to be that. And I mean, the way that they ended it, it didn't put anybody over. They had Scott Hall come in with the taser or whatever, and it was just, it didn't put anybody over. It was just a way to appease Kevin Nash, I think, to an
Yeah.
extent.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that goes into that. I've always said that the guy that should have ended Goldberg's streak was DDP.
Yeah, that Halloween Havoc.
That, or they could have done it at Starcade as well, like ended the year with that, and it would have made him. It would have made for this interesting story going into '99 and stuff like that. But hey, that's not what happened. And the same can be said with Dr. David Schultz as well, because he probably had a lot of opportunities that he could have had in WWE, but then this slap just for some reason ruined his career. And they even started off in the episode by saying that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought us back around to the topic at hand. Because you know me, if you get me started to talk about Diamond Dallas Page, we'll be here all
I know.
night. Uh, But yeah, I mean, it was kind of similar to this, where so we talk about him upholding kayfabe and kind of the way he was trained by Herb Welsh would really kind of feed into that. They talk about him training in a barn, and back in this era, that it wasn't like today where you go to wrestling training and they're like, all right, yeah, you're gonna take some bumps and we're gonna teach you this and we're gonna teach you this, and it's no, it was, we're gonna see if you're tough enough to be in this business. We're gonna see it. We're gonna stretch you. We're gonna see if you can wrestle, if you are actually, worthy of being here in this business. And I think he mentions here that it was either 3 or 6 months um, before they sat him down and said, "Hey, okay, well, all right, you've been beating the shit out of our wrestlers, so let's smarten you up," as Jim Cornette likes to put it.
Yeah, I noticed that, and actually, like I think he said 3 months, because it would, the normal wait would be either 6 months or an entire year or something like that. But Dr. D. David Schultz was already showing that he wanted to be there, that he was a legit tough guy, and so rather sooner than later, it seemed like it was like, okay, you know um, let's smarten him up, because obviously he wants to be here, and he'll make a great wrestler. Here was the thing too about his training that I heard from the historian himself, Jim Cornette. I love the story that he told of Herb Welch would take a dump in his bag, literally take a shit in his bag, and would rub it on his armpit, and then would just grind on the guy with a headlock. And I'm sitting there going, "Oh dear God!" Like, like I don't think I've ever heard of that in my life, and I don't think I'm so glad I did not try to get into wrestling at one point when that happened.
I have a somewhat similar story. It's not nearly as bad, but
Oh,
when I was coming up, we had a pretty small like locker room, and well, you've been in there. It's actually it was at Patriots Park. That area where the bathroom is. That used to be our locker room back in the day.
right.
And as you know, it's not very big. I mean, there's a
Oh,
bench where maybe like 5, 6 people can sit down, and then there's a couple showers and a couple of stalls, and that's the whole place.
right.
And we kind of had to take turns. Like you pretty much only were in there if you were changing or whatever, or going over your match maybe.
Right.
Well, one of the kind of veterans on the show made it a point to, like, a few hours before showtime, like right before everybody would get there, he would go in there and just take a massive shit. I think he was saving it up all week. Uh, and I'm not gonna say who it is, but it used to happen, and anybody that was there can back me up on this. So similar, but there was no rubbing the feces on themselves, which is, I mean, way, way
He
beyond.
would just, wait, he would just take a shit in the bathroom or something?
Well, yeah, but it's all one open room, so like it would just smell horrible in there while
Oh,
everybody was changing.
okay. Oh God. Oh, that's horrible. But
Yeah.
nothing to the degree of rubbing it on your armpits.
No,
Like,
that's where it stops being a rib, and that's just disgusting.
yeah.
Yeah. Um. So yeah, I mean, a lot of his kind of upbringing from a wrestling standpoint really fuels into who David Schultz is as a performer, because this is a lot of the reason why kayfabe was so important to him. I mean, even Hogan, he famously tells the story, which I don't even know if I believe that shit, but he tells a story about them breaking his leg his first day in the gym, training for wrestling, and and then him coming back after that and him kind of earning those guys respect. I don't know if I believe the story or not, but it's kind of that similar idea of he was brought up to protect the business. Unless you were behind closed doors with only other members of this secret society of wrestling, you were your character. You were the gimmick at all times.
Right. You didn't play wrestler, as they said,
Right.
or as they say today, kind of thing. Like, because you can tell Dr. D, David Schultz, he didn't play wrestler. Like that wasn't acting.
Right. He was a legitimate tough guy.
Yes.
And there's very few of those in our business anymore. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. A lot of people, I know a lot of locker room veterans that'll come in and say, "Oh, wrestling in my day used to be a bunch of bikers and bodybuilders and tough guys, and now it's a bunch of nerds and shit." I mean, and that happens. I mean, that I've heard that 1,000 times, and I mean, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but there is a notable difference of, in today's wrestling world, there are a very few legitimate tough guys out there.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the reason Stone Cold Steve Austin became so popular. I
Right.
mean, when he found the Stone Cold gimmick, he was a walking, talking badass. Like everyone was just like, okay, I should not mess with that guy. Same thing with the Undertaker. I mean, even though the Undertaker, has one of those gimmicks where it's very easy to, be an actor and that kind of thing. He didn't do that. He legit became the Undertaker, and it was like when he was the Undertaker, you felt his presence, and that's what I got a lot with uh, Schultz in this. Like when I saw the interviews that he cut and the promos and even the video that he did with WWE with his family, that they had him with. I saw that and I just went, "Oh my god, like this guy is amazing. He has charisma, natural charisma. He was a natural heel. He was what Dusty Rose would be like. He's a natural baby. Like he was amazing looking, and it sucks that he wasn't able to get a bigger spotlight than he did.
Right. I mean, I'm going to paraphrase James Drake here. And, and one of the things he says is, "I can't make you believe that wrestling is real, but I can make you believe that I am real." And that is one of the things that was about David Schultz was it didn't, I mean, you might have had your doubts, but you weren't going to have your doubts about him because he was the real deal. He would,
Yeah,
as we see, slap the shit out of you.
yeah. Like and I understand that saying completely because I believe Stone Cold Steve Austin's even said stuff like that. I can't make you believe that wrestling is real, but when you look at me, you're gonna go, okay, well that guy's real. You know.
Yeah. I mean, it's it's a scenario where, I mean, in this case it was, a recipe for disaster. And I think Vince McMahon maybe knew that going into this. Um, so let's talk about how he gets into WWF at all. We kind of jumped ahead of ourselves a little there.
Right.
Because it had to do with Hogan, and I definitely throughout this episode, you can tell that there's definitely some huge resentment towards Hogan, um, you know, from Schultz, because they
Oh
were
yeah.
friends. They had great chemistry. Hogan had him brought up, and I'm sure that it was presented as, "Oh yeah, this is a great way for you to be in the WWF." But what it really ended up being is he was kind of like this big tough guy, but they wanted him to kind of be talent enhancement for Hogan.
Yeah, Hogan needed opponents and stuff like that, especially like if you're going to groom him to be, the biggest baby face of all time. You have to have a villain, you have to have opponents and stuff like that. And that's not necessarily a bad job to have because that means you have a little bit of longevity then in this sport, like you might not be in the spotlight or like pushed as far hard as Hogan was, but you at least know that like, hey, I can make other people, so then they need me to make those guys.
Right. Absolutely. Um, so as we kind of go into it a little bit more, you noted earlier that Jim Cornette is like the only person here that is a speaker that wasn't directly involved, and that's not something I picked up on. And I think that is, that does kind of speak highly of Jim Cornette. that he's that much of a historian that something he was completely removed from, he can still tell you all the details about.
Yeah, absolutely. Because he didn't work for WWE at this time. He wouldn't come into WWE until 95 or 96, one of the two. But I know that he came in around that time. But he was, he was around Crockett around this time, or any of the other territories that were still in existence at that point.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've kind of talked about Schultz a bit. He's coming in. Dr. D is being positioned as like the big heel against Hogan. Um, and he's been promised he's never gonna have to worry about money again by Vince McMahon. He's been made all these promises, kind of a callback to the Herb Abrams episode here. Vince McMahon just kind of being that carny promoter. Oh yeah, you're never gonna have to worry about a thing. Um, and then, so on the other side of the fence here, we enter John Stossel. John Stossel, of course, is working his way up through the entertainment industry. He's trying to make a name for himself as a big reporter, bringing down all these shady companies and industries and things like that. And he has set his sights on professional wrestling. Um, and of course, John Stossel is, as he said, the only way that he can make this presentable to the average audience is he has to find someone to help him expose it because he doesn't know the secrets of the business.
Right. He thinks that it's fake at this point.
Yeah, he was an amateur wrestler, right? So now he thinks, okay, well, I'm an amateur wrestler, so I know that this isn't legitimate, so I'm gonna see what I can do to ruin it.
Yeah, and when we talk about John Stossel in this thing, my whole thing with him throughout this episode is just like, why? What do you have against pro wrestling that makes you want to possibly ruin the lives of everybody in professional wrestling? Like, take away their very livelihood. This is the way they make money. It might not be much money, and there might be crooked promoters and stuff like that, but to go after the crooked promoters, but don't sit there and be like, oh, I just don't appreciate people being bullshitted and stuff like that. To me, if people think that like when people thought that the business was real, I look back at that and go, man, that should have been like the media should have on pro wrestling have been like, this is the most brilliant thing because it's fake, but you think it's real.
Right. And I mean, the thing is, it is an art form, and
Mm-hmm.
I wish that it would be embraced as such a thing. And it's not people being bullshitted. You don't go to the circus and say that people being bullshitted at the circus. You don't go see a magic act and say people are being bullshitted. You know,
You don't
um,
even go to like a rock concert and say people are being bullshitted, concerts and stuff.
right? Yeah, I mean, it's just it's like Kiss, for example. Those guys are playing characters when they perform. They don't walk around like that all day every day.
Yeah,
But
I mean, we all could tell that.
right, right. But John Stossel apparently is, that's being bullshitted to him. And let's face it, John Stossel, I think, did this episode thinking that he would be vindicated in some way, but really, Stossel just comes across looking like a complete bitch in
Oh
this
yeah.
whole episode. I mean, he is just cringe worthy. I mean, we talked about this before. Like, if I had a choice to be in a room with John Stossel or New Jack, I would much rather hang out with New Jack, even though even though I might die. But John Stossel, like, I'm going to prison for murder if I hang out in a room with John Stossel.
I know. I know. I was thinking that this whole time. I was because like every segment he spoke, I was just like, I just want to punch this dude in the face so badly.
It's a shame that he hates wrestling because he would be such a great like heel manager for someone.
Yeah.
Just bring his cringe-worthy, punchable face out there and just let him talk shit about the other guy. Um, you know. So yeah, I mean, so this is where he does in fact find somebody to help him expose the business in one Eddie Mansfield.
Yeah. Yeah, Eddie Mansfield, and he was so much better, wasn't he?
Yeah. So here's the thing about Eddie Mansfield, right? It's like Eddie Mansfield was never, he was a retired ball player. He was used to being treated like gold in the, and he wasn't a great ball player either. But
I,
even the worst, like guy in like the MLB is probably treated better than like any mid-tier guy in wrestling, especially on the indies. I mean,
yeah, that was my thing. It was like Eddie, how do you expect to be treated?
right. I mean, and he wasn't very good. He was never going to make it in wrestling, as Cornette confirms. I mean, I've never met anybody that can name a great Eddie Mansfield match. Um, and I do want to note that friends of the show, the Tapped Out Wrestling Podcast guys over there, they actually on their Patreon page they did do an interview right after this episode with Eddie Mansfield.
I saw that.
Yeah, so if you want to check that out, definitely go over there. It's a good interview. I watched it. It's definitely interesting, and I think that he does regret honestly the way that this all played out. Um, it doesn't come across that way on Dark Side of the Ring. On Dark Side of the Ring, it kind of came across as he didn't like the way it turned out, but he also kind of wanted. It's like he still got that chip on his shoulder against the industry.
Yeah.
He's still trying to make it sound like he did this for the boys, but really it was, okay, well, if I'm not going to make it in wrestling, then I'm going to expose you.
Yeah, and that's so sad because it's like when he talks about himself, he's like I had this great charisma and I could talk. And I was just like, dude, you can't even talk talking normal. like like his whole interview sounded cringe worthy, and that whole bullshit about, oh, I did this for the boys. And the way that he talks about, people keeping kayfabe, like he says it with, just like how John Stossel says he didn't appreciate people being bullshitted, was the same way Mansfield came across. Like it sounded it was with such disdain and everything like that. And it was just like, wow, dude, and here's my thing, okay? Look, we all know that there's a lot of promoters out there that are scum, that are crooked and everything like that. It's hard to tell these days, at times who is and who isn't. But my thing is when people complain about it, I'm sitting there and I just want to, like, I was yelling at Eddie Mansfield. I just wanted to go, then go out and get another fucking job, which is what you ended up doing in the first place.
Yeah.
Like if you're just that unhappy with things, then go out and get another job that you can make a lot of money, that you will be treated like you think that you should, but you're not going to get treated like a king in professional wrestling unless you are the top guy, which you were never going to be.
Yeah. I mean, and Eddie Mansfield, he did eventually kind of find his footing in wrestling like years later as a producer. But I mean, as far as like being one of the boys, he was forever blackballed by completely exposing the industry, as he should have been. I mean, especially back then. I mean, he was getting death threats. He had to be escorted out of the South by the FBI. I mean, the guy, I mean, he comes in, he exposes the business, and I mean, I think he instantly regretted it because I'm sure he came to John Stossel saying, "Yeah, I want to expose the way that the workers are being treated in the industry, this and that." And knowing John Stossel, he's probably like, "Yeah, yeah, we'll make it about that. Yeah, but you got to tell us how the wrestling world works in order for people to get that." And then of course, like they just kind of cut out everything that was about that because I
Of
mean,
course.
don't get me wrong. The way that performers are treated in the industry, I mean, the only person that's ever really given a shit about that in the media is John Oliver, and he's talked about it at length. Those are great episodes if you want to check it out, where he talks about WWE and Vince McMahon and the way that a lot of WWE's performers don't even have health insurance.
Yeah, yeah, and I want to point that out real quick because I mean, yes, but here's the difference. John Oliver is still a fan of wrestling. Like he even says it before he goes on with the report that he does, which I love his show. It's one of my favorite shows, and stuff like that. But before he goes into it, he goes, "Now I like wrestling."
Right.
Like he says it. I love wrestling. I love the characters. I love the stories and everything like that. But then, then he goes on, but there are some things that I don't like about it that need to be fixed. And I agree with his point of views. But the way Stossel did it, as you pointed out, like, and maybe that's what Mansfield did have the intentions of. I can't really tell, to be quite honest, with his interview. But but I think the telltale sign was when all Stossel asked him to do was just like, oh, okay, how does this move work? Oh, show us the blade. Show us the blade. And even Mansfield was just like, why does that matter? Like, okay.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to discredit the idea that the talent in the world of professional wrestling needs some sort of union or some sort of set of regulations or something like that. That's not the point. The point is that this turned out to be not about that at all, and it really just became, it looked vindictive on the part of Eddie Mansfield for his own lack of talent. And then it also, he just kind of fed right into what John Stossel wanted to do, which I'm sure John Stossel thought, hey, I'm about to bring this whole industry down. I can only imagine what he thought, 10 years later when it was like the hottest thing in existence.
And the fact that it pretty much, like he even says it, it has defined his career and he hates that.
Yeah.
You can tell that he hates it.
And I love it, man. It's like he says it's like his second most famous interview or whatever, with him getting the shit slapped out of him, you know. So he does this whole thing. Mansfield exposes the business. He gets all this done, and then he wants to go into the depths of WWF, and he wants to talk to some of the wrestlers and kind of get like the other side of the story here. Which they said in the they said in the episode that he talked to the Sheik first.
I know. I was wondering about that.
Like, how did he make it through that? That's what I want to know. I want to see that. I mean, I'm sure it might be out there somewhere. I don't know, but I want to see that. Um, for sure, I want to see that. That being said, he makes it past the Sheik, and Vince McMahon, in typical Vince McMahon fashion, sets this up knowing it's going to go horribly wrong. He sends David Schultz out to talk to Stossel, knowing that Schultz is the real deal, that he's incredibly protective of the wrestling business. And I mean, hell, even on the Dark Side of the Ring episode, he's hesitant to even give away anything about the business on the Dark Side of the Ring episode, and he's been removed from the business for decades.
Yeah, that's how dedicated he was.
Right. So he's definitely not going to put up with this guy calling what he does fake. And of course, now we get to the moment that is the slap heard around the world, where he slaps the dog shit out of him,
Yeah.
and it was amazing. I've watched it like 90 times.
Right? It was great because I mean, to me, it was just like, well, Stossel, you got what you deserved.
Right. He said it was fake. And it's as Cornette said, man, he didn't rear back or anything. I mean, he's just sitting there and he just slaps him. I mean, like, just all nonchalant, just slaps him, and he goes down, man, and he gets right back up, and he's like, "All right, well, you want to get back up?" And he slaps the shit out of him again. And
Because you know what? I guarantee you, Schultz would have had the same thing done to him at the old when he was getting trained.
yeah, probably worse,
Probably.
And
Well, if I could, real quick, here was the thing too. Stossel makes it seem like he went up to Schultz and was just like, all I asked him was there are people that think that this is fake.
Right.
And that's not what you said, you lying fuck. You said, I think this is fake.
Right. And you got shown, it's like we said earlier, Schultz couldn't prove to him that wrestling wasn't fake. He proved to him that he wasn't though.
Yep.
And of course, now Stossel is filing a lawsuit, and now enter Vince McMahon being Vince McMahon, and basically throwing Schultz under the bus for it, even though he's the one that sent Schultz out to talk to him.
Yeah, that was just such a bullshit move.
And it's classic Vince. Vince McMahon wants to do the edgy thing. He wants to, take the risk and everything like that. But it's like he has no problem hanging you out to dry over it. And after that moment, after that happened, at this point, Schultz is damaged goods, and so they send him over to Japan for a little while. And the Japanese, of course, like make this a gimmick for him, which I thought was hilarious. I mean, he just beats the shit out of reporters.
Which they've done that with a shit ton of like wrestlers over there. They still do it to this day, especially anyone who's like over 7 feet.
Right. And I mean, it's definitely like an interesting concept. And I mean, honestly, I feel like if this happened today, I feel like that would have raised his stock in the business. Because we look at things today. I mean, unless you like harm or seriously harm or kill someone, publicity of any kind is generally good publicity.
Yeah.
And something like this that you know is famous around the world would carry a ton of weight today. And I think that honestly, if this had happened today, I think he would maybe face like a 30-day suspension, and then he would be even hotter when he came back. You know,
Yeah, because the wrestling fans would have appreciated it.
right? I mean, you know, we what was it? Titus O'Neil at Greatest Royal Rumble, where he trips and falls and slides into the ring. I mean, that got played all around the world to the point that they even had him do it again on Raw. Like that was I was worried that was going to be his new gimmick that he trips.
Yeah.
Um, you know, but yeah, I mean that was like one of these kind of just fluke happenings. It's not really the same situation, but I mean a lot of people went from not knowing or caring who the hell Titus O'Neil was to thinking that that clip was one of the most hilarious things out there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty much how Titus got really, really popular, and especially Corey Graves laughing the whole time pretty much.
Right. Yeah. So, this happens. They send him over to Japan. He comes back and he's like, yeah, all right, I'm ready to come back. WWF is facing a lawsuit over this whole ordeal. Um, and of course, like, there's this whole thing where like WWF's lawyer said he was good to go. Basically said that Stossel wasn't injured or whatever. And then on the other side of it, you have Stossel like milking the whole thing, saying his ears were ringing every day and it was making it hard for him to parent his daughter and all this other nonsense.
Oh, that was yeah. Like I'm glad you pointed that out because that was such bullshit, and like anyone who's ever been in wrestling knows that. Like, I mean, you could have a chop fest on your chest, and that shit will be cleared up in like 3 days, maybe a week tops. Like especially depending on how many times you get hit and everything like that. But that whole bullshit about, oh yeah, yeah, my ears were ringing. No, they weren't. No, they were not. Like, and he didn't even get slapped in the ears. He got slapped on his face.
And he even says like he basically admits that he was the one bullshitting everyone in
Yeah.
the interview where he's like, it all went away as soon as I got paid.
Yeah. Yeah, that pissed me off so bad. And this is the same guy who said in the beginning of his interview, I just don't appreciate people being bullshitted to. When
Right.
you bullshitted an entire company and a man's life, you jackass.
Right.
As you can tell, I'm such a fan of Stockholm in this.
I don't think anybody's a fan of John Stossel. But so we got this whole situation, kind of leading up to WrestleMania one. One of the biggest heels on the other side of this whole thing, the other side of Hogan, is Dr. D. David Schultz. And then so after all this happens, the build up to WrestleMania one is taking place, and Schultz is mysteriously left off of it entirely. This would be like today if you had, your biggest heel going into like the Royal Rumble and like, February, March, and then WrestleMania comes around and they're not even on the card. And that's pretty much what happened here. The build up kind of started. They were bringing in this whole, you know, um, Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper versus Mr. T and Hogan. And the celebrity aspect of it, of course, is there. But I mean, I think that if we had had Schultz in the place of Orndorff, this probably would have been a much bigger and well thought out storyline, especially with the talent and the promos that Schultz was capable of.
Oh my God, I was just about to say that. Like, can you imagine him and Roddy Piper together cutting promos like that?
It would have been
They
amazing.
It would have been incredible. It would have made Schultz maybe even bigger than Piper, if you think about it. Because Piper went on to, become a movie star as well from WrestleMania 1 and stuff like that. But imagine if Schultz had been in that. Hollywood would have looked at that guy and went, oh my God, that's a walking, talking badass right there. Get him in a movie right now.
Right. I mean, he could have definitely been like an action star of some kind. I mean,
Mhm.
hell, he pretty much ended up being the real life version of that later on. Where we talk about him becoming a bounty hunter after he got out of wrestling and uh, getting a lot of notoriety and whatnot because of that. And it probably paid a lot better, to be honest.
It might have, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But going back to WrestleMania 1, it was even kind of before that that things really started to go bad for him, because there was a lot of stories that have been told about Schultz that say that he was trying to fight Mr. T, and say that he slapped Mr. T and stuff like that. And he even says in the interview, he's like, I didn't slap him.
Yeah, it
I never
doesn't.
slapped him.
It doesn't sound like they had even an altercation of any kind.
No.
It sounded like Schultz was pissed because he was being left off of what was, planned to go down as one of the biggest wrestling shows of all time. With when the company had been relying on him to get all this heat against Hogan, and Hogan was his buddy that brought him up, to WWF, and then he kind of just turned his back on him as soon as it was profitable for him to do so.
Yeah, and it sucks too, because it would have been fine to still have Mr. T in the main event. But if you had had Mr. T and Hulk Hogan versus Roddy Piper and David Schultz, there'd have been even more people watching, in my opinion, because they would have been like, okay, we know that wrestling is kind of staged by now, but it's like, or they have an idea of it at least. But like when they saw that, they would have tuned into that like they would Ali versus Frazier.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I think so, and especially as much as they had built the two of them up, but and the amount of clout that Hogan had backstage at the time, I think he definitely could have gone to bat for Schultz, but he just didn't. You know, he kind of cut him loose, and I would be pissed off if I was him too.
Yeah, and Hogan even tries to say in a podcast interview, and it was on Stone Cold's podcast. It's not on this, but he tried to say that Schultz tried to attack Mr. T, and it's years later after the fact. It's like, dude, you could have just said no, nothing happened. Like Schultz didn't attack him, and I'm a piece of shit for not, sticking by him.
Well, Hogan ain't gonna admit that. We
Obviously,
know that for sure.
yeah, for sure.
That ain't gonna happen. Um, yeah. So I mean, this whole thing, I mean, the we always talk about Dark Side of the Ring that there's always some sort of tragedy at play that happens in every single episode, and the tragedy here is that we kind of both the audience and Schultz are robbed of him having any kind of prominent career because Vince McMahon blackballed him everywhere. Vince McMahon had more control over the wrestling industry at this point in time than he does today, far more.
Yeah, because I believe Schultz even tells the story that he tried to get booked on some independent dates, and they were technically getting a paycheck from Vince at that point, and they said, "No, we can't bring you in," because Vince threatened to, you know, I guess shut them down if they had him on his show. And I'm just sitting there, just like, why, Vince? Like, what?
Yeah.
Really?
I mean, and if you look at it today, he couldn't do that today. Vince McMahon can't make a phone call to AEW or Ring of Honor or NWA or MLW or any of these places and go, "Hey, yeah, don't book such and so. He did this, or I'm done with you." They're gonna tell him to fuck off,
Exactly. As well, they should.
right? But back then it was kind of seen, this was when he was still doing talent exchanges with different territories, saying, all right, well, I'll send Andre down there for a few weeks, you send your star up here, blah blah blah. They still kind of had that notoriety going on, and it was an opportunity for the promoters in those territories to make big paydays, and they weren't giving that up. But I mean, today obviously everybody that's under contract, Vince isn't letting them wrestle for anybody, anymore. So he doesn't really have that kind of sway over, the different scenes. The only place that they had that kind of control over would have been Evolve, and they recently just bought Evolve,
Yeah, I saw that.
and I mean they basically owned Evolve for years anyway.
Yeah, I mean that's why Evolve had a network special
Yeah, I
on the
mean it was a failed promotion. I mean they were going bankrupt before their partnership with WWE existed. And so, yeah, I mean, you just kind of imagine Vince having that kind of partnership with all the major territories at the time, or at least most of them, to the point that Schultz, being as prominent as he is, couldn't get any work. I mean, this would be like if like Bray Wyatt got canned by WWE today. Can you imagine how many places would be like itching for him to work there? I mean,
Absolutely.
he would have the next 2 years booked up in a few days if he took all those bookings.
I mean, hell, look at what AJ Styles did with TNA. I mean, he walked out on the promotion with their belt and stuff like. I mean, obviously it was more of a storyline, but he walked out on them, like told them, "No, I'm not re-signing with you," and he went and became bigger.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Schultz would have had probably a similar path ahead of him had this not happened with Vince. And it, I don't know if there's something
No,
that
he
kind
could
of
have.
we don't know about behind the scenes as to why Vince would do this.
Right. He could have ended up in NWA or WCW at the time.
Right. Absolutely. And he probably would have been a big deal there. But
Probably.
he moves on and he becomes, a bounty hunter, as we talked about. And I mean, this was cool, man. Like, watching that stuff, I kind of got excited about it. I was like, this is kind of like reality TV before it was a thing. Kind of like Dog the Bounty Hunter had his kind of heyday. I would
Yeah.
much rather watch Dr. D. David Schultz, you know, as a bounty hunter or whatever.
Well, because again, he's real. Like he was like, especially when I saw this, then I was just like, oh my god, this guy is almost the equivalent to like Chuck Norris. Like
Right.
he is legit that much of a badass, and it shows. And if you think about this, you see the success that he had as that bounty hunter. How did WWE, you know, kind of let bygones be bygones and look at that and go, oh my God, dude, if we bring him in now, he's the bounty hunter, but it's not a gimmick.
It
Like
would have been such an amazing gimmick for him, you know.
it would have
But
because it would have been real.
WWE at that point, or WWF rather, was trying to go more into the cartoony kind of, drink your milk, eat your vitamins, say your prayers type nonsense that really continued until the Attitude Era, and then we kind of see more of them trying to do that today. Maybe not as much today as 5 or 6 years ago, but the product still, I don't think the product has ever benefited from being watered down in such a way.
No, absolutely not. I completely agree. But here's the thing, I think, and if you're about to bring this up, I'm about to beat you to it. But um, here's the thing that pisses me off in this episode the most, even more than Stossel and more than Mansfield, is the fact that, Schultz goes and does his bounty hunter thing, and then Hulk Hogan goes on TV and chokes out a reporter,
Yeah,
or not even a reporter. He choked out a talk show host on live television.
yeah, and face zero repercussions for it.
Well, obviously because he's Hulk Hogan, and that was even kind of towards the buildup of WrestleMania 1. And then what pissed me off the most was the fact that Schultz was trying to protect the business and stuff like that, and then guess who's the one that exposes it?
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, man, Hogan like Hogan choked that dude out. Hogan wasn't trying to defend the business. Hogan was literally just like, I mean, he was just trying to show off.
Yeah, exactly. And then Vince McMahon himself goes and exposes the business
Yeah,
to
for
try,
money.
to try to get less tax, or to try to get a tax cut, basically, because they were now, because he didn't want them to look at them as sports anymore. He wanted them to look at them as entertainment. In fact, when Ted Turner purchases WCW, the famous line, "I'm in the wrestling business." Well, I'm in the entertainment business, pal. And it's like,
Right.
really?
And he does it to get around all these regulations and whatnot. Of course.
Exactly. But yet he's in the entertainment business, but yet it's still a wrestling show.
Right. Well, I think we've just about covered every aspect of this episode, man. What was kind of your overall thoughts and your takeaway from this episode?
That pretty much the only person that gets royally screwed out of something is Dr. D. David Schultz. He should be talked about still to this day. I mean, they talk about Rowdy Piper still to this day and obviously he should have been in that spot. But if you think about it, Orndorff is an afterthought in that. But had Dr. D. David Schultz been in that position, he'd have been as big as Piper. In fact, they probably would have been a tag team for years to come, and they might have been one of the biggest tag teams of all time. And then that could have led to a matchup against Demolition or the Road Warriors eventually. I mean, can you imagine the money that would have drawn? Like it because he was a legit walking, talking badass. And when you have something like that in wrestling, I mean, good Lord, you have to hold on to that as much as you can, because you definitely don't get it nowadays, and you rarely got it around in the '90s until Stone Cold Steve Austin, Triple H, The Rock, all them. They were badasses. But David Schultz, he was a legit one. He was real, and everything about him, just it screamed charisma, it screamed real, and it screams star as well. Like, I mean, he should be one of the biggest names of all time. But unfortunately he's not. Eddie Mansfield is, I'm sad to say, a little bitch for what he did. And if he regrets what he did and stuff like that, which I'm sure he does to this day, then maybe he can be forgiven. But John Stossel, on the other hand, all I have to say is go fuck yourself, man. Like, I hated him from the minute I saw him in this episode. He basically tried to ruin a man's life, and he tried to ruin a whole industry. He tried to have wrestling non-existent. He looked at it as like the smoking industry, basically the tobacco industry, which is just total bullshit, because there are people that make a living doing wrestling, and you want to ruin everything just because you think you hate people being bullshitted on, but yet you bullshitted your way into making money off of the WWE kind of thing. And
Right.
So really, just what you should get out of this is David Schultz was screwed, and and if you have the chance to try to find some of his footage, go back and watch it because I guarantee you a lot of his matches must be great. Especially like what's interesting too, that we kind of forgot to make a note of after that interview that he slaps the reporter, he goes and wrestles Antonio Inoki
Yeah.
in the WWE ring. I mean, good God. Like, that was just kind of an afterthought in this. And I'm sitting there going, Antonio Inoki versus David Schultz. Like, yeah, I want to see that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, man. I don't really have to go back over everything. I think you uh kind of covered it all there, man. I agree with everything you said. I think Schultz was screwed here ultimately. I think we have Vince McMahon being Vince McMahon, just another example of that, and another reason that Dark Side of the Ring is probably incredibly hated around WWE for exposing him as he is, and we'll get into that more when we finally get the fortitude to do the Owen Hart episode.
Oh.
Um, but yeah, man, I definitely think that that kind of puts the rubber stamp on this episode. It was a great episode. I really enjoyed it. It talked about, it kind of had all the staples of a Dark Side of the Ring episode that we kind of talked about. There's a tragedy, there somebody got screwed over, there's kind of the reality aspect of it where reality and the world of wrestling clashed. So yeah, I mean, it had all the makings of a great episode. um, that being said, there's a couple things I want to talk about before we get out of here. um, Speaking of a great episode, our friends over at Suplexes and Microphones, they recently had Chris Wiggins, who has been a guest on this podcast, on, and he talked for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, just kind of about his career in wrestling. So I wanted to kind of spotlight that a little bit. Go check out Suplexes and Microphones if you haven't. They've talked to some of the best, um, you know, kind of people in the Southeast indie scene, some of the best talent, and yeah, I mean, go definitely check them out if you want some kind of in-depth interviews and he kind of looks at the personal and professional lives of some of the talent involved in indie wrestling in the Southeast, if that's of interest to you. That being said, speaking of podcasts, you, as I understand, have a new podcast that you just kicked off.
Yes, yes. I believe you are talking about the brand new Power Rangers Go podcast. Yes, I'm not talking about wrestling on something for once.
Right.
I'm talking about Power Rangers. And it is me and one of your favorite people, James, the superhero homie Q, Mr. Quentin Ficklin. And also, since he's already got enough nicknames, there's an episode coming out on episode 3 and I've got a new nickname for him. Are you ready for it?
Yeah. Lay it on me.
He is now going to be known as the ace of the morphing grid.
Ah, that's just perfect. Since of course one of his monikers is the ace of professional wrestling, and on the first episode, which I thoroughly enjoyed,
Thank you.
you dropped the ace of everything, and I
Yeah.
really like that. I'm gonna start using that when we bring him back on this show eventually. I'm definitely gonna mention that. We are gonna have him back on. Special announcement: we're gonna have him back on, and we're gonna be covering something that's probably the most requested thing, other than the Owen Hart episode, for us to cover, which is the Undertaker's Last Ride documentary.
Ah, yes, and I love the Undertaker, so that's going to be a great one. I mean, he's one of my favorites of all time. I don't care what anyone says.
Well, and to this day, I haven't watched a single second of that documentary, and so what I'm gonna do, normally with these episodes, I usually watch them, and then I'll watch them again right before we do the review. But with this, I'm gonna really take my notes and everything from my first impression of it. So I'm gonna wait until like right before we're gonna do it, and I'm probably just gonna binge all the way through it. And yeah, I mean, I wanna be fresh to it. I haven't watched any of it, so I'm
Well, that's
excited, man.
Yeah, I'm excited about that too. But yeah, everyone, check out the Power Rangers Go podcast with me and Ace. And we're talking obviously about everything Power Rangers. We're going through Mighty Morphin to now I think it's Beast Morphers. is what it's called. Like we're going through it all, and I'm having a blast doing it. I'm having a fun taking a trip down memory lane with it. And I believe on an upcoming episode, we're going to have a certain someone who's down there at the bottom of your screen, folks, on this podcast to talk about the monumental moment for Power Rangers, which is when, of course, the Green Ranger appears. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to having you on that. And also check me out on SWN, the Stovall Wrestling Network, where I talk about the current news going on in wrestling or just give my thoughts on what's going on. And then, watch a little bit of old wrestling and talk old school wrestling and maybe give you ideas of what you can watch out there. Some people are like, what wrestling event should I check out? Well, I'll tell you on Stovall Wrestling Network, and it's a lot of fun. So check out both of those podcasts. We're growing every day, man.
Yeah, and I mean, right now with so many people, ourselves included, that really can't deal with the crowdless wrestling, there's no better time to go back through the archives and check out some of the things you might have missed. So yeah, definitely check out SWN. You can check myself out on Entertainment Evolved on Facebook or on YouTube. Yeah, man. So as always, Caleb, thank you for joining us. And we will be back pretty soon to do, as I said, the Owen Hart episode, Dark Side of the Ring. I think that's the only other one we're probably going to do for right now. Check out our season 3 predictions episode, which will be up by the time this airs, and last ride. So yeah, thanks everybody. This has been an Involved Review.